Okay, we had been discussing the Renaissance and been watching it develop through various phases to the High Renaissance, where we see a focus on perfect harmony and balance. We focus on humanism, the world understood through human activity, through human perfection, through the human mind. But also, as we see both with Raphael and Leonardo here in the High Renaissance, a strong focus on symmetry. We're going to look at one last region in the High Renaissance, and this is the region of Venice. It's quite a ways north in Italy, sits on the Adriatic Sea, and we'll see that the Renaissance there takes on a very unique character. It's very different from what we see in Rome or Florence. One of the things we see right off the bat is that the focus that we saw with Raphael, Leonardo, and others on balance and symmetry and perfect harmony is in fact different. You'll see here if we bisect each of the pictures that with Raphael it bisects right around Plato and Aristotle and is really quite well balanced left to right. With Giorgione's picture on the right in Venice, the bisecting of the canvas shows us that in fact the symmetry is kind of all out of whack. We have the figures almost entirely crowded to one side of the composition, and the opposite side left wide open. This is the moment when the shepherds come to worship the infant Christ, who has just been born, and the Holy Family, who are ostensibly the focus of any nativity picture, are pushed off to the right-hand side. Joseph and Mary both praying to a very cute baby Jesus, maybe one of the cutest babies that we've seen yet in class. Joseph following the Virgin Mary's lead, praying with his hands in the same way hers are. The shepherds doing the same thing, especially the shepherd in green down on his knees. But you'll notice that all of this is crowded off to the right, and the left is the left-hand side of that canvas is left entirely open. So one of the things this does, of course, is it makes the shepherds themselves more the center of the composition, more of the focus of the picture. And we'll see that this is in fact important to Venetian artists in particular because of certain traditions in Venice, an interest in the countryside and the people who dwell in the countryside. And Giorgione is picking up on that. The other thing we see, of course, is that the landscape becomes half of the composition, and thus incredibly important to the composition. We know from technical studies that as Giorgione was working on the canvas, as he was building up layers of paint, that he gradually pushed the grotto with the Holy Family further and further to the right and opened up more and more of the background to the landscape. So we know that this is incredibly important to him as a motif, and certainly it underscores this rural area away from the city, and you can see the city in the background, parts of it under construction. But we're not there. We're out in the middle of nowhere, distanced from that. We're in the world of the shepherds. And I think that's part of what Giorgione is trying to do with the landscape, is to create this sense of being outside of the city and in the world of the shepherds, who are in fact the focus of the composition. The other thing to note in the landscape is the interest in atmosphere and light and time of day. Notice how the light falls on the buildings coming in from the left-hand side, very low on the horizon as it strikes the side of that ruined tower. Sort of a gentle evening light, and even in the sky we have this sort of hazy cloud cover that the light is breaking through low on the horizon and out of sight behind that hut on the left-hand side, but definitely striking those buildings very, very low. At the same time, you'll also notice that he's added nifty little touches like the candlelight in that arched window next to the bush. One wonders if we have another issue of natural light versus supernatural light. And I think that is, in fact, a theme that he's dealing with. Remember, we saw this elsewhere with Campan's Annunciation, the idea that the light of God obliterates natural lights, that painting where we saw the candle snuffed. Well, here we see a candle still burning, inside that archway, and maybe perhaps this is an allusion to that same theme. But here are our shepherds now. And you'll notice as you look at the shepherds that while the light in the background falls low on the horizon, the light in the foreground falls diagonally and pools on the shepherds from over their shoulders, from above. It's a separate source of light that's illuminating the Holy Family and the infant Jesus than the light that falls in the landscape. So again, we have this idea of supernatural light illuminating the scene in the foreground and natural light in the background illuminating the buildings. Certainly, I think this is symbolism. This is now, again, that reference to the light of Christ. And as we look at the painting, we look at the upper left corner, we can see that the trees in the upper left corner are actually lit from our side. There's a well of light around it here in the upper left corner that's not coming from the same source as the light that hits those buildings in the background. And if we look behind our principal shepherds, we see two more shepherds by a tree behind them, and they're looking in the direction of the source of light. They've recognized that source of light. And if we look more closely there, we find that there's an angel coming in that is in fact illuminating those trees. So that is the source of light, the angel is, that falls on Christ, on the Holy Family, and the shepherds in the foreground. So it's some standard ideas that we've seen in a lot of religious pictures, the light of Christ coming at his birth, illuminating the world to lead us to salvation, but also very much done with a different focus, in this case, a focus on the shepherds. Now, with this interest in shepherds, we need to talk a little bit about Venice. Landscape and the world of farms, shepherds and whatnot, became very, very important in Venetian art and in Venetian poetry. In fact, when we talk about Venetian art, one of the things that we see is a great interest in ancient Roman poems that focused on the rural landscape. And in Roman poetry, there was a world called Arcadia, a land called Arcadia that was populated by shepherds, and it was a land that had not been developed yet. The Roman Empire had not really touched, where in fact traditions were continued, and really, mythologically speaking, time would stand still. It was a time when people were in greater harmony with the land, and it became a respite in Roman poetry, a respite, an escape from the more increasingly rural city life in ancient Rome. This is exactly why it was also very popular in Venice. Venice itself was, of perhaps all of the Renaissance cities, the most intensely urban. If you know Venice, you know that it's basically an island. It's actually originally a series of islands that were paved over using pilings. They would drive timbers into the muck and then build on top of it. I'm sitting here in Amsterdam. It was built exactly the same way. And there was really no green space. There was no landscape in Venice to go to. So paintings that evoked a sort of perfected world, an Arcadia, a modern Arcadia of green space and mountains and realistic landscape became incredibly popular in Venice. These pictures like these really became a sort of visual escapism from the urban nature of Venice. Now, this interest in pastoral poetry, right? Arcadia and pastoral means poetry focusing on the lives of the shepherds, became very, very popular. And we see it reflected in numerous paintings that seem to evoke the themes of these poems. Titian is probably the single most famous painter from Renaissance Venice. Slightly younger than Giorgione, he studied under Giorgione, became his own artist, independent, give or take, around 1510. Giorgione died in 1510, very, very young, only 37 years old. But you can see in this famous picture from the Louvre in Paris that Titian shares Giorgione's interest in pastoral themes, in themes of going out into the landscape to discover a life that is unspoiled by progress, popular in Rome and now again in Venice. What we see is a fellow dressed quite nicely in red. He's from the city. He's a musician, and he has gone off into the countryside to look for inspiration. Here's a close-up of him. What is his inspiration? It is this life of the shepherd. And in fact, he's looking directly at the shepherd as he composes his song. The shepherd is in part his inspiration. He's looking for a life that's unspoiled by modernity, unspoiled by progress. And the shepherds present that ideal to him. So the shepherd's life is in fact his inspiration. There's another shepherd off to the right with his flock. Shepherds are often depicted as musicians. We saw this early in the class with some adoration of the shepherd's imagery. And so shepherds are definitely linked to music in the minds of people from the Renaissance. It's obviously quasi-erotic, homoerotic. They're staring very deeply and longingly into each other's eyes. And the picture is, really utterly non-religious. I think maybe for the first time we're looking at a picture that has absolutely no religious overtones. Not even the Roman things that we saw from people like Botticelli. They still had Christian overtones by associating one god with another. But this is utterly a secular picture. There's nothing religious about it whatsoever. And you'll notice that while in the physical realm, our musician has been inspired by these shepherds and their rustic, perfect way of life, you'll also notice that there are these two naked women with them. And one of them, with her back to us, we can see part of her in our detail here, holds a flute. She is probably intended to be a personification of music. In other words, she is the tune that he hears in his head. So he doesn't see her. We see her. And this idea of embodying an idea within human form is a totally ancient Roman artifice that Titian is using here. She stopped playing her flute because now the song is in his head. So visually, physically, his inspiration is the world of the shepherds, but the women are basically, this woman is the embodiment of inspiration. With that in mind, of course, the second woman off to the left, who is either pouring water into a well or drawing water from a well, she is also linked to the idea of inspiration. If we think about adding water to the well or drawing water from a well, both of these are alternative ways of talking about being inspired. Go back to the well to get another jug, or filling up your mind with ideas. So Titian's work is a work about how life in the countryside, a rural, perfect existence, might inspire people who live in the city. This idea of eroticism in the countryside can be found often in Venetian art. Giovanni Bellini, another Venetian painter, gives us an image from Roman mythology. This comes directly out of Roman poetry. The poet Ovid, who often wrote about gods frolicking in the countryside. And that's exactly what Bellini gives us here, a very erotic scene of life in the countryside. In this case, based on the poem by Ovid, we can read the picture if we know that poem. This is a feast that's being hosted by the god of wine. In ancient Rome, this is Bacchus. And any party he throws, that is, wine will flow freely. So here we are in Arcadia. Normal rules don't apply. You've moved from the rules of society. That was part of the attraction, right? You can go out and harmonize with nature. And as at Bacchus's party, everybody has gotten drunk. They're all drunk, and they're horny as well. Sorry about the box being in the wrong spot. Neptune, the god of the sea, we can tell he's the god of the sea because we can see at his feet is his trident, his pitchfork, if you will. And he's had too much to drink, and he's flirting it up with Persephone, the goddess of the spring. She seems receptive to his advances. Needless to say, that's quite a bold first step in any kind of dating ritual, to put your hand there. But that adds to the overall erotic theme of the picture. On the right-hand side, and now the box is in the right place, is Lotus. She's the goddess of chastity and is often associated with fresh water. And she's drank herself to sleep as well. But because she's chaste, she's not herself encouraging any kind of interactivity. But as she's fallen asleep, the god of the harvest, whose name is Priapus, begins to unclothe her. He's already loosened her bodice, baring her breast, and he's now lifting her skirt as well while everybody looks on. They're basically watching him have his way with her because she's fallen asleep. Not at all critical of date rape. It's pretty horrific if you think about it in modern terms, but somehow to the ancient Romans and to the Renaissance, this was all hunky-dory. He is the god of the harvest, as I mentioned, Priapus is, and he's got his scythe, and he's go ahead and hung that in the tree because he doesn't need it anymore. He's got other things to reap, so to speak. So he's left that aside as he gets around to business. Now, if you know anything about Priapus as the god of the harvest, in Roman mythology, because harvesting is men taking the good bounty from the earth, which is woman, Priapus, because of that sexualized reading of harvesting, is usually illustrated with an incredibly large male member. Here's a Roman picture of Priapus with his priapic genitalia. And what's interesting is Bellini doesn't show us that, but what he does show us, and this is rather kind of humorous, is the figure of the god directly behind him holding a violin, and the violin neck is basically exactly where his priapic member would originally be. So this is a very non-judgmental, it's very frivolous loves of the gods in the countryside. And even though we've often talked about how Neoplatonism associates the gods of Rome with with Christianity, this one I think is entirely secular. I don't think there's really anything here to be read as to some sort of Christian allegory with this. This is just meant to be a sort of a sensual celebration. And we know for in fact that it was commissioned by the Duke of Ferrara. Ferrara is just sort of to the southwest of Venice. And Duke Alfonso d'Este was the one who commissioned Bellini's Feast of the Gods. It was part of a cycle of 4 pictures he had planned beginning around 1510. And Bellini's picture was the only one that was ever completed. That said, about 10 years later, Alfonso d'Este went to Titian to complete the cycle, to paint the other 3. And so Titian was called back in and painted 3 other pictures for this private study. And all of them are the sensual frolicking of the gods. Here is one of them, the Bacchanal of the Andrians, one of the first that Titian painted as he completed the cycle. And he went back into Bellini's work, and he actually repainted the background so that it would sort of line up with the background of his new picture. And you can see that while originally Bellini had painted those trees you see on the right, all the way across, what Titian does is come back, he's painted the left-hand side with the same light falling, where there's that drunken man on the hill in the background. That same light that falls on him falls on the background of the Feast of the Gods by Bellini. So he added to this. Now, Alfonso d'Este, the Duke of Ferrara, went to Titian specifically because Titian had actually studied under Bellini. After Giorgione died, Titian spent a little bit of time in Bellini's shop as well. So if you're going to have somebody complete a cycle that was started by Bellini, Titian is really the one to choose. Also, by 1520 or so, Titian had established his career. It was really one of the strongest painters, not only in Florence, but in all of Italy. He began to work soon for the Holy Roman Emperor, numerous works to the Emperor's palace in Spain, worked for dignitaries both in Italy and in Northern Europe. He was a courtier. He was a painter who was really very much in demand. And we see here on the left another picture of wanton drunkenness. Andros, the island of Andros, is an island where rivers run with wine. And we can see the theme of the picture as one of the characters holds up a glass pitcher of wine. And wine is just flowing everywhere. And people are dancing, playing music, falling over drunk and naked. You'll notice that the figure in the corner pretty much mirrors the placement and the pose of Bellini's figure of Lotus. This is how Titian is tying it together. And everywhere we look, people are just enjoying the heck out of themselves with way too much wine. They're going to have one heck of a hangover in the morning. Even the little boy right behind the naked woman has been enjoying it. He's actually urinating directly at us there. So again, these are meant to be somewhat humorous, even though, of course, there's nothing really humorous about what's going on in the Feast of the Gods to modernize. In the Renaissance, these all would have been seen as frivolous and humorous. Finally, Titian's cycle for the Este family, for the Duke of Ferrara, assured his fame throughout Europe as the preeminent painter of erotic mythological pictures. Images that really amplify the sensuality of Roman mythology. Here we see in the National Gallery Venus in her boudoir, in her toilet. She's been washing herself up, putting on her jewels and her makeup, her perfumes. She's making herself beautiful because, after all, she is the goddess of love. And you can see that her pose with one hand over one breast and one hand down below by her hips mirrors the ancient statuary of Venus that was so common that Botticelli had used one example for. But he's placed her seated and has covered up the lower part of her body with, as you can see, velvets and jewels and furs. All of this adds to the sensuality. It's all about touch. She touches her chest as she grips the fur lining of the robe, and then there's that luscious velvet everywhere. It really is an invitation to all of your senses, to the sensuality of Venus. We have two Puto there. One is actually Cupid, the other one of his helpers, and one of them crowns her, gives her a laurel crown for her success in making herself beautiful as she looks into the mirror, and kind of looks at us as well. The other figure is Cupid, and he's holding up a mirror to her so she can see her work. We know he's Cupid because if you look down by his ankles, you can see the quiver with its arrows, ready to shoot you, the viewer. And this is, again, a kind of winking, participatory picture, because who is Venus preparing herself for? It's you. You, the viewer, the lucky owner of this picture, is the one for whom she's making herself beautiful. And you're the one that's going to be shot by Cupid's arrow. And she's just making sure that the job is done, that she is sufficiently beautiful before she turns her gaze to you. And there's a sense that as we see that lone eye reflected in the glass, that perhaps even with the glass at that angle, she can already see us just as we can see her. Here's a close-up of her hand clutching that furry hem of her robe, and how the luxurious velvet of her robe is captured so well by Titian. Titian was a master at leaving paint unblended. It's not tightly painted. In other words, he's not trying to obliterate all of the brush strokes and make it look polished like almost every other Renaissance picture we've seen. But instead, you become very aware of the paint as paint, if that makes sense. Look at the edge of her arm. Imagine if Leonardo had made it blurry like that. He would not have let you see the paint strokes. But up in here by the elbow, you can see how the paintbrush is dragged across the surface so that you become, again, aware of the sensuality of the medium of paint. And then we look at the highlight here of the velvet. And you can see that as we get in close, the highlight breaks down to be these individual strokes of paint that sort of add to that sense of physicality, of sensuality. And that's true throughout his pictures, especially here in the middle to end of his career. It meant that Titian, as this sort of quintessential bold painter, became every artist's favorite painter for decades or centuries to come. In fact, we'll see as we continue to trace the history of art how often Titian will come up as a painter's painter, as someone to whom later painters will look back to, more so even than Michelangelo or Raphael.